Thanks, everybody. I'm very happy to be here. Hugh, you have a much stronger New York accent than I do.
But you're from Brooklyn, so you're tough.
That's true. I am from Brooklyn. So there. A little bit about me. I grew up in New York City in the 1980s when it was a complete hellhole. That's a picture of New York when I was growing up. And then I continued to grow up there in the 90s when it was a city that honestly could have gone either way. We weren't exactly sure. And then it turned into the New York that it is today, which is safer and more gentrified than the one I grew up in. That's my big brother. He's 4 years older than me. His name is Jake. We're going to talk to him a little bit later on. But a huge influence in my upbringing was my big brother's love of punk music. And this is him at age 14 when he gave himself his first mohawk. And I followed soon after. My parents were not happy about it. And then about 18 years after that, this happened. This happened. No.
European central banks are rushing out assurances of support for financial markets if the latest Wall Street upheaval severely disrupts trading. The U.S. Federal Reserve has taken emergency steps to calm the markets as investment bank Lehman Brothers announced plans to file for Chapter 11. Bankruptcy would mean the end of a 158-year-old company that survived world wars but could not outlast the global credit crunch.
Yeah, that's a little strange here. We're down 1.7% here, a loss of 37 points or so. Apple shares are just getting hammered this morning.
We're down by between 3 and 4.5% generally across these markets. Let's talk about the speed with which we are watching this market deteriorate. We're red everywhere, essentially, down by 4-5%.
We're down over 16%. Dow at the same time has fallen about 18%.
The stock market is now down 21%.
Because we're now down 43%.
What in the world is happening on Wall Street?
Two-year no yields went from 190 to 166 in the blink of an eye.
I have never live looked at the Dow Jones Industrial Board and seen a 600-point loss.
Having said that, I think there could be a sentiment on the street that being an independent investment bank is not possible anymore. It shouldn't be possible anymore. And that fear, that emotion, may be enough. That was a pretty terrifying moment in my life, and I'm going to get back to that in a second. We can get ourselves into a false sense of security, that industries that have been around forever, companies like Lehman Brothers that have been around forever, are going to stick around forever and are going to be able to adapt and be able to endure change. And in the blink of an eye, you wake up one September morning and it's gone. That is the age we are in right now. So before I kind of dive into my story about that, I want to take a moment. I want you to turn to a neighbor next to you and think about this for a second. Imagine what would cause the financial crisis to happen to your industry. Share that with the neighbor. I'm going to give you a minute, and then I want to hear some of your ideas. So one of the challenges that Kevin pointed to, and Hugh pointed to, and Greg, great name Greg, pointed to was a decline in membership, an aging out of membership. Do you see that at some point hitting a tipping point where it puts your industry or your association in an existential crisis? Is that possible? Could you see how that's possible? I don't have to imagine what the financial crisis was like. At the age of 27, my first ever job in a startup was an investment research startup called Innovest. And they hired me in 2005 with a simple question. And they needed someone with an economics background to answer it. I happened to be someone who was willing to work for that little amount of money with a degree in economics. And the question they had was, how much longer will the housing boom go on for? And what opportunities still exist for investors to make money in the housing boom? That was their question. And I used a huge amount of data and I boiled it down, and it was a very early implementation of what is now known as big data and AI. And I came up with an answer. This is not going to be a sustainable boom. There is a huge amount of debt that is dependent on people that have never had access to credit before paying that back. When they default, the mechanics of the financial system are such that it's going to be a multi-trillion-dollar crisis. The first bank that will collapse is Lehman Brothers. The second one is going to be Bear Stearns. The third one is going to be Merrill Lynch and Countrywide Financial. It became the first ever prediction of what we now know as the 2008 financial crisis. That was the first product that I ever launched in 2006. All right.
Short the market?
That would have been illegal. That would have been insider trading. So no. All right, not that I got caught doing. All right, that's like the superhero version of the first product I ever launched. The survivor version of it is probably a bit more accurate. The minute we pushed that platform onto our product, the circumstance of my situation was that all of the major banks on Wall Street were not only, I had to analyze them, they were also our biggest clients. And so the first 10 minutes after I pushed the product and it showed up on all of the terminals and all the screens of all of our clients, my phone rings at my desk, and it is the House Counsel of the fourth largest investment bank in the world, Lehman Brothers. Just to reframe that a little bit. It was the person whose job is to sue people on behalf of the fourth largest investment bank in the world. And I pick up the phone. He says, "Hi, is this Gregory Larkin?" I said, "Yes." "Hi, we've seen your product. We saw your prediction. We are suing you individually. You will be personally named in a lawsuit. We also are a major client of yours. We have pulled our client contract. This is not how you treat Lehman Brothers." About a half an hour after that, it was another major bank that made it through the financial crisis, so I won't name them. It was the same thing. You will be individually named in this lawsuit, and we've just canceled our client contract. By 5 o'clock of the first day of my first ever digital product release, I was going to be named in 6 different lawsuits from the 6 largest banks in the world, and 70% of my startup's revenue had just been threatened to be canceled. That's the first product I ever launched. And after this spiral, I called up my CEO, Matthew Kiernan, and I said, "Matthew, I cannot believe I have put you in this position. I am extremely sorry. I had no business saying what I said, doing what I've done. I understand completely that the right thing for you to do is to fire me and to do it very publicly so that everyone else who wants to kill me knows that you killed me first." And there's a long pause. And he says, "Well, were you wrong?" That was his first question. I said, no one's asked me that yet today. No one has pointed to a data point that was incorrect. No one has pointed to a mathematical calculation that was wrong. I think they're uncomfortable with my conclusions, but now that you ask it in that way, no one's actually been able to find a flaw in the actual data. I think they just don't like my thoughts, not my facts. He said, "Good. Everyone who called you called me first." And I want to tell you what I told them. If any of them carries through with their threat, I will take out 2 full-page ads on the back page of the Financial Times and on the back page of the Wall Street Journal, publishing your report and publishing their rebuttal. People don't fight you this hard when you're wrong, so keep going and say it louder. By the way, this was a time when full-page ads were still a going concern. Speaking of disruption, we'll talk about that later. So just as a demonstration of leadership, I think that's probably behind every great innovation that comes forward, there's a leader who had that kind of loyalty and that kind of solidarity and that kind of courage. But the flip side of that is you can reframe that in a completely different way. Sorry, there we go. A lot of the banks that we were competing against had all of the technology. They had all of the data. They had all of the people they needed. But when they had that same phone call from those banks, they didn't have a leader like Matthew Kiernan standing up and saying, if you push us, we'll push you back. And I understand this is going to be hard, and I'm risking the future of my company, but I'm going to move forward with this. That is the only reason that we were acquired for $22 million in 2009 in the epicenter of the crisis. It is the only reason that, I don't know if you recognize the final voice on that montage of the credit crisis, but that was me on the evening that Lehman Brothers collapsed. I was the person who was on the national news saying, this is how we got here, and this is what I think is going to happen next at the age of 28. And the only reason that happened was more about courage and organizational change and a willingness to speak truth to power, and much less about technology. And if we're going to talk about innovation and we're going to talk about disruption, we have to have a very strong and difficult conversation about power. Who has it? What are you using it for? What do you actually have to fight for? What is the old guard standing in the way of? That's a very tough talk to have, and I hope we can have that talk together today. Since that time, I've launched 33 products in huge companies in Google, Uber, PwC, Bloomberg. It kind of ranges the gamut. Last week, I helped Anheuser-Busch launch a new beer. That's a first. Beer on the blockchain. So I just want to totally be upfront about where there's a gap in my resume, which is, I think all of you work in associations, and many of those associations deal with healthcare. I got nothing. I got very little. I've been part of certain associations. So I hope this is a conversation and that you keep me honest and think, co-conspire with me about how what I'm talking about in other industries might be relevant to your own. Punks and pinstripes. When innovation happens, that's always where it starts. You have the punk entrepreneurs joining forces with an executive leadership team of pinstripes. And when they find one another and they join together and they find a common problem that needs to be solved, that hasn't been solved, and they can solve it in a way that is unique and has never been happened before, and they rewrite the playbook, that's usually the biggest driver of disruption. And all of us have the ability to make that kind of disruption come to life. I want to talk today a little bit about what some of the pillars are of that and how disruption is evolving. This talk couldn't be happening at a more important time because we are absolutely in the epicenter of a new normal where disruption is the norm. You have industries that have been around for hundreds of years that disappear. The news industry will never be the same again because of Twitter and Google and Facebook. Amazon has made retail a completely different animal than it was before. Who would have predicted that Sears wouldn't be with us anymore? You have companies like Dollar Shave Club, launched out of a garage in California, putting a giant 130-year-old titan of industry like Gillette on the back ropes. And throughout all of this, the most critical ingredient when you're on the inside of an organization that is at risk of disruption is you always have to think of the cost of not innovating. Very often, the mistake that gets made is people take technological tools like artificial intelligence and the blockchain, and they treat them as shiny toys because they don't solve a mission-critical problem for their market. They don't deliver commercial results with it. They don't deliver a change in behavior and impactfulness for the people they serve. And if you take technology and you don't solve a mission-critical problem with it, it becomes a dormant and very expensive asset. When you activate it, you have to activate it by aiming it at a critical problem that poses a disruptive threat to your organization. It's the only way you can get it to work. I certainly, when I worked across Wall Street, you had gigantic AI labs that didn't generate a single dollar of revenue or income. They could be pointed to when investors were having a stroll through the office, but they weren't actually used to generate income or to save money. The wave of disruption that we're in right now is fundamentally different than the first wave of disruption. Who knows who this is? There we go, Mark Zuckerberg. What do you notice between the difference on what's the picture on the left? Describe it to me. What do you think is changing here? That's the punk. Why? It's got acne, yeah. And what about this picture on the right? What does that make you, what do you think is different about that? Yeah.
His lawyer suggested how he dressed that day.
Probably. This is disruption 1.0. This is a wave of entrepreneurs like Mark Zuckerberg, like Sergey Brin of Google, who dropped out of college. In Sergey's case, he dropped out of Stanford. You have Jeff Bezos. That wave of disruption was going direct to consumer and bypassing editorial boards in media, for example, giving people exactly what they want, offering them access to products in the case of e-commerce and Amazon, faster, smarter, cheaper than ever before, digitizing all of the workflows of a very intricate, very archaic, very old system that hadn't really evolved. Yes, there is a little bit of incremental innovation, but that's not the same thing as reinvention. Sure, all of those companies had computers, but they didn't exactly do what Facebook was doing. And they reinvented a way to go straight to the hearts of consumers and give them the things they wanted and needed, and gave them the tools for communicating with one another and buying stuff and sharing information with one another. That was the first wave of disruption. As those organizations have grown up, they've had a level of systemic importance where now you're starting to tinker with the way elections are decided. Now you're having leaks of data that have trillions of dollars of risk associated with it. Now you're having to testify in front of Congress. How are you going to handle that? That's the first wave of disruption. I think all of those trends are still alive. We are not in an age where media is out of the woods. We're not in an age where retail is out of the woods, but that's also the rearview mirror of it. That's not where the next big wave of disruption is going to happen. The next wave of disruption is going to happen very differently, and I think this is what it's going to look like. Does anyone know who that guy is on the left? Anyone? That is Gary Hoberman. He is the Chief Technology Officer of MetLife Insurance. He was considered one of the most visionary CTOs in an extremely old company in an extremely old industry. Visionary, smart, got into lots of trouble, but could rein it in. They like taking investors through Gary Hoberman's tech lab. Anyone know who this person is on the right? That's Gary Hoberman, now the CEO of Uncork, a no-code platform. What do you notice here? What's the difference between the guy on the left and the one on the right? You went from pinstripe to punk. You said it. Right? Gone is the suit and tie. Gone is the pinstripes. And with it is a guy who, with a huge amount of prestige, a huge amount of stability, a huge amount of money, but an enormous amount of frustration at how slow things were. How many times did he have to see that an outcome could have been delivered faster, but for some reason, people said it can't. We can't do it that way. And eventually, 10 years ago, someone like that would have hit up against that wall of can't, and the best option available to them was to go to another life insurance company and try to negotiate a little bit more of a sandbox to play in, a little bit more freedom. That era is done. Gary Hoberman is part of a massive entrepreneur exodus outside, out of the Fortune 500 and into startups. We haven't seen anything like this before. He knows exactly who their customers are. He knows exactly what the regulatory environment is. He knows exactly what the power dynamic is, and he can reinvent every piece of the plumbing so that it is smarter, faster, better outcomes than ever before. This is some other people in the entrepreneur exodus. Because of them, we are going to see waves of disruption in industries like investment banking, insurance, healthcare, management consulting. Industries which have been touched by disruption, but not like media has, not like retail has. We haven't seen that kind of disruption in those industries. These are industries where going straight to the hearts and minds of a consumer isn't good enough because there is so much regulation. The buyer of the product is very rarely the actual day-to-day user of the product. You have procurement systems that are extremely complex. You have regulatory systems that are extremely difficult to navigate. And yet, you have people that have deep and total fluency in all of those systems and exactly what those procurement processes are that are going back and starting from scratch to reinvent it, rather than continuing to dismantle all the bad bits and try to reinvent from the inside. That's the next wave of disruption, and we have not seen anything like it in our lifetime. It is the entrepreneur exodus. There's a few other components to this next wave of disruption. Has anyone here ever worked in like one of the big four accounting firms or in McKinsey or Deloitte? No? So if you ever walk around the floors of Goldman Sachs at 10 o'clock, you will see thousands of people still working at night at 10 p.m. And if you were to have a clipboard and go through and tap them all and say to them, hey, can I bother you for a minute? They'll probably curse at you and throw their food at you. But yes, you can bother them for a minute. And you ask them, what are you working on right now? Chances are they will have an Excel spreadsheet open in front of them. And they will be there until midnight, copying data from a PDF file and pasting it into an Excel spreadsheet, and then clicking a button to run an analytic on that data. They probably didn't get the data until their vice president left at 6:37, and they have to get that data ready for a presentation to a CEO of a company that's thinking of buying another company the following day. So then they have to transport that into another product in the Microsoft Office suite, PowerPoint, to get it ready for the CEO to look at it. And if you go to a place like McKinsey at 10 p.m., you'll see the exact same thing, except it goes from PowerPoint to Excel rather than Excel to PowerPoint. The exact artificial intelligence that when you're in Netflix knows this person is probably going to like to see this show could do that person's job for them. You talked about self-driving cars, Hugh. That's not an accident that happened. That's called image recognition AI, meaning that car knows that image in front of it, the AI knows that is a fire hydrant. It is not a 3-year-old toddler that might jump in front of your car. Therefore, you can continue driving at the speed you're driving. All of that is happening with artificial intelligence. Do you think that same AI can't identify the profit and loss statement of a company from last quarter and auto-populate it? It raises a bunch of other questions, right? If you were to continue with that clipboard and you ask each of those people, how much money are you making a year? How much of your salary gets passed through to your clients? Who's your boss? Why are you using this technology? And what databases are you pulling from? What databases are able to speak to other databases? Is this mission critical because of some compliance measure? What's going on here? You would start to see billions upon billions of dollars of wasted time and wasted money that doesn't need to be there. The first wave of AI was, don't make me think, right? There's something that's easy and automatable, just automate it and don't make me think. Don't make me drive my car, right? Just park my car for me without me having to think about it. The next wave of AI is going to go into where there's huge armies of Harvard MBAs and saying to them, you know what? You can use your brain again. Imagine that you got to think about how capital markets could become more better and how a deal can be structured in a better way. Use your brain creatively. You have things that machines don't have. Why don't we have you in this bank do that thing? Think in that way. Create in that way. Build alliances with people who you've never spoken to before so we can think creatively about how to reinvent other industries. That's not happening. That's the next wave of AI. And it's people like Gary Hoberman who are part of the entrepreneur exodus that are going to bring that to life. Anyone inside of a bank and inside of a management consultant and any entrepreneur really anywhere, you inevitably slam into the wall of can't. When you are that person and you do try to introduce artificial intelligence or innovation, you're going to be told, I'm sorry, we can't do that. Can't technically means it is technologically or physically impossible. That's really not what they mean when they say can't. What they actually mean is, I won't. We haven't. We don't. I don't see how it's going to make me look good. That seems like a risk that I'm not willing to take. Can't is very rarely can't. And the biggest indicator of who is going to be disrupted is when you start to look at the inventory of can'ts in an industry, in an organization, across multiple organizations. Every time there is a false can't and you start to ask, how much money are you leaving on the table by doing that? There is a startup. There is an entrepreneur that is tracking that inventory, adding up those numbers and inventing against it. They can go to the consumer and do everything that you said you can't do. They will do it. They're doing it. That's the age of disruption we're in. We've seen that affect certain industries, but where that goes next is something of an entirely other order of magnitude, because we're looking at systemically important institutions in that next wave of disruption. The world wasn't going to collapse without Gillette. The world wasn't going to collapse, really, without the Chicago Tribune or Sears. Yes, important, but that's a consumer luxury on some level. Investment banks are kind of different. That's how governments issue bonds. That's how companies acquire one another. When Lehman Brothers collapsed, it was a giant calamity. That's what we're looking at now. So how does this look like? So everyone knows who this is, right? Elon Musk, right? Does anyone know of his company, SpaceX? Yeah? You've heard of it? So what's really interesting about SpaceX, in my view, is SpaceX would have never been possible without Northrop Grumman. Elon Musk, prior to SpaceX, despite the image he portrays, is not a rocket scientist. He never was a rocket scientist. He was a product manager at a very good company called PayPal. So what was he doing in the rocket business? Well, it's pretty easy. He surrounded himself with people who were astrophysicists from places like Northrop Grumman, from places like NASA. He surrounded himself with people who understood exactly what the NASA procurement process looks like. And he built this coalition of people, and he kept asking them, does it have to be that way? Why can't we do it this way? Why can't we reduce that hurdle? Why can't we reduce that step? Can we make it a little bit more efficient if we did X or Y? And eventually, when he actually won his first government contract with SpaceX, it was 10 times less expensive for 2 times the value than the second cheapest bid. Just by starting from scratch and asking about it all over again. That's a completely like microcosm embodiment. That is this harbinger of what we're about to see. So remember my big brother Jake? I told you that we would talk with him a little bit more later on. We've grown up a little bit. I don't look like that anymore. Jake doesn't have a mohawk anymore. In fact, I knew I was coming to a place where there are a lot of doctors or a lot of medical associations and people who worked in healthcare. So I wanted to do some homework about what disruption might look like in that industry. So I spoke to Dr. Jacob Larkin, an obstetrician gynecologist in Pittsburgh. That's my big brother now. He has literally gone from punk to pinstripe. If anyone is looking for a 6'8" gynecologist, I recommend him. He's great. So I kind of wanted to hear from Jake what's happening in healthcare, which I think of as a rock-solid industry, which is not too open for disruption, that is coming across his desk. And the story he told me that is definitely on his radar is the brainchild of these 3 men. That's Jeff Bezos, Warren Buffett, and Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Morgan Chase. They're also 3 of the wealthiest people in the world. What I love about this picture is that Warren Buffett, who I believe is 91 years old, has more hair than Jeff Bezos. A year and a half ago, they came together and collectively made a decision that healthcare costs were spiraling so much and eating into their respective profit margins that it was getting completely out of hand and needed to be brought under control. And they decided to launch their own healthcare startup, Haven. When they launched it, this is what Jamie Dimon said. The best results in healthcare are not the most complicated or expensive. The right care is often more effective and less costly than what we get today. And their plan from the outset was very similar to what we saw with SpaceX, taking some of the executives of the payers, from the hospital networks, from insurance companies, and going in a completely vertically integrated way to look at every process of the patient experience, from diagnosis to finding care to paying for care, and identifying waste and cross-fertilizing all of those opportunities for greater efficiency with people from Amazon and Google who maybe don't have a background in healthcare. And so kind of building this coalition of entrepreneurs and punks and pinstripes. And before it was ever built, before it even had its first release, the market noticed right away. All the major healthcare stocks plummeted. It wiped out $6.8 billion of market capitalization in 4 days. Nothing had even been built yet. It was an announcement from 3 rich guys. And the idea that they were taking their very sizable missiles and launching it at this very big problem, just the idea that they, who had a track record of success, were now aiming the sights of their gun on this mess, was enough to make everyone freak out. That's a great example of the next wave of disruption. So where does this leave us as associations? I think you guys have an incredible opportunity. I think you're in an advantageous position to take advantage and be part of the next wave of disruption. I don't think you are victims of it. I think you are in a position of strength to make it work for you and to stimulate growth around it in a few different ways. Like I said before, every great innovation starts with a coalition of punks and pinstripes. And I think what you and associations have the opportunity to do is entrepreneurship without borders. On some ways, in a unique way, you're in a position to take some of the biggest systemic disruption problems confronting your industry and form coalitions. Have people that don't necessarily work in the same company, who aren't necessarily part of the same generation, who don't necessarily have otherwise an opportunity to meet with one another and share a vision about how the future is supposed to be and bring that vision to life. But they can do it through you. And if you sort of reframe that as your purpose for being, I think some incredible things might come out of that. That's certainly what gets me excited about it. A great innovation scholar called Kevin Ordonez put in your first book, I think, you said, imagine that employees are freelancers being organized and led based on standalone projects rather than ongoing functions, as sort of a futurist scenario that we can think about. But we don't have to imagine that. That's actually a fact. This is a company that I believe has less than 20 employees called Working Not Working. And it's a coalition of some of the greatest digital designers who have left digital agencies. They are now, forget about doing like freelance work for mid-sized companies. These are actually the designers now, this 20-person company that is doing work for Airbnb, Adidas, IDEO, The New Yorker, Google, Pixar. That's Working Not Working. That's a team of 20 people and an army of independent, very senior design entrepreneurs doing some of the most cutting-edge brand work for some of the most cutting-edge brands. So that's a vision that can come to life. What would that look like inside of your associations if that were to come to life? Think about that. This is one of my favorite, so I wrote a book, it's called This Might Get Me Fired, and I launched a lot of products in very big companies all the time. So I kind of go from high-level thinking, and then I get real messy, and I build stuff. But this is one of my favorite punk and pinstripe power couples of my life. On the left, that's a joint venture that I built out with Google and PwC. It was a product studio that I built with them. And on the left-hand side, you see Dave Pittman. Dave Pittman is a senior partner of PwC. He was the founding partner of PwC Japan. He's a very big deal in that organization. Kind of intimidating guy. And on the right-hand side, you see Brooke Cow. Here's another picture of Brooke Cow. She was tattoos all up and down her arm, but she had another superpower in addition to being very direct and very punk, was that she's what I would call a full stack designer. And what that means is she could run a kickoff session for a digital product, create the first paper prototype of that product, run the first round of user tests with that prototype, take the information from those user tests, build it into the first coded prototype of that product, and then architect it so that all of the data was wired up. One person. The entire user experience, the entire development experience of a product. One person. And I was kind of worried about introducing her to Dave Pittman because they have opposite attitudes, but the minute Dave Pittman met her, he was like, where have you been all my life? You are the person who would put PwC out of business if you weren't here. And he wound up flying her around to partner meetings all across PwC in multiple countries. And his message was essentially, she is the most important person in this company. Outside of this company, she poses an existential threat to everything that has existed in this 175-year-old accounting firm. Right now, we have an opportunity to work with her, to collaborate with her, to design the innovation that might put us out of business if someone else like her did it outside of our company. But we can do it here. So make sure that the Brook cows of the world can find themselves a good home inside of this organization. That's your job. Every time an organization changes, they need a godfather like Dave Pittman to say, this has got to be the new normal. It has to be. They have to have that degree of like new religion about it. And once they get that coalition together, you have to do this. Never pitch an idea, only pitch an outcome. No one risks anything when they say no to an idea. Outcomes are kind of different. When you give people the creative freedom and the resources to start changing things that have to change, and then they come back to you, and instead of a PowerPoint about hypothetically what they might do, they come back to you with an experiment that worked and ask you to invest in that. That's the difference between the disruptor and the disruptee. The disruptors are pitching outcomes. That's the approval process. We all have to think about what that looks like inside of our organizations. So, just to bring it all together, are you solving a mission-critical problem that is going to pose an existential threat? If the answer is yes, keep going. When you encounter can't, is it don't or won't, or is it shouldn't? If it's don't or won't, that's not a good enough reason to stop. You got to keep going. Can you form a coalition of punks and pinstripes? If the answer is yes, keep going. And are you in a position to pitch outcomes rather than ideas? If the answer is yes, you've just gone from being a disruptee to a disruptor. Everything I just described there has nothing to do with artificial intelligence. You don't have to be a quantum computer engineer, right? This is a completely human process of disruption. All right, you all have a survey in front of you. Please fill that survey out. I really want to know how I can improve. I am deeply flawed and error-prone, so I genuinely want to hear your feedback on that. I did write a book. It is called This Might Get Me Fired. If you come outside and you give me the survey, I will give you a copy of my book. I hope I have enough for everybody. I think, Emily, do I have I think there's a table outside for me to do it. I read a lot of books, and I'm not just gratuitously self-promoting my own. These are two that I am deeply excited about. Francesca Gino has become a friend of mine, Rebel Talent. She's a Harvard Business School professor. Her book's amazing, and it doesn't get enough play in the disruption circuit, and I think it should. So I highly recommend that. And then the $1 Billion Brand Club is brilliant. Lawrence and Gracia, amazing. Just read it. It's so good, and it's such an incredible profile of the kind of heart of the entrepreneurs that created this disruption, and you get to sort of see inside the studio that launched these things. Brilliant. You are all authorized to please take out your phones and connect with me. If you scan that, if you go into LinkedIn and you open on the top bar and you press that QR code reader thingy and you scan that, you will then connect with me on LinkedIn. So that's one way you can stay in touch with me. And I want you to stay in touch with me. I didn't write this book for gratuitous self-promotion. It wasn't an exercise in me trying to become famous or a celebrity or anything. I wrote it because I've lived my life as an entrepreneur, and it's really hard. And it can be very lonely. And you can find yourself taking risks and becoming isolated in ways that are scary as hell. So if that is something that I can help you with, and if that feels like something that you've had to experience, I very much want to be able to be of service. That's why I do this. You can also email me. I'm Greg at Bowery315. and you can hang out with me. I'm a nice guy. I'm going to stick around for the day, and then I'm going to take a plane back to New York. I'm also writing my next book, so if you think you have a story of a punk and pinstripe power couple, please let me know. I'm really sourcing those. There's an opportunity that it gets into the next book. The next book, I think, is going to be called Punks and Pinstripes, not sure. I'm also on tour a lot. So these are some of the places I'm going to be speaking at. I'm going to be at South by if anyone's going to be there. If you have an event coming up and you think my message would be of value to your audience, then please let me know. And then the most important thing, do you need that? Someone need? Okay. And I think the most important thing I want to leave you with is this. Be courageous. One of the most unheralded moments of entrepreneurial bravery is when someone inside of a huge organization, a very old organization, has the courage to step forward and say, I know this is going to be hard. I know that very powerful and deeply entrenched systems and processes and people stand in the way of this coming to life. I know I'm taking an enormous personal risk by committing to this, and I'm doing it anyway, even if it gets me fired. We don't hear about that enough. We see the ribbon-cutting ceremony, but we don't see that moment before the ribbon-cutting ceremony where someone had that kind of courage. I think we all have the ability to demonstrate that kind of courage. We all have the ability to use our associations to create a good community for people who do demonstrate that kind of courage to find solidarity with others. So I hope we do that together.